Now we come to one of my favorite questions, something that you might be asked to explain in an interview, which is how does else work in a Python loop? Now, just about all of us who've been programming Python, even from the beginning, know what else is. Else is a thing that, well, yeah, let me see. You know, if I say x equals 5, and then if x equals 5, then print, yes, it is 5. And else, print, no, it is not 5. And not surprisingly, right now, it will print, yes, it is 5. And if I say x equals 6 here, then we'll get, no, it is not 5. There we go, open and shut case. But I wasn't asking, or this question isn't asking, what does else do? The question is asking, how does else work in a Python loop? Meaning not if else, but something else, so to speak, entirely. So how's this going to work? Well, how about this? If I have here s equals a, b, c, d, e, f, and I want to look for d. So I can say here, look for, first of all, of course I could say, look for equals d. And then I can say, look for in s. And that's going to give me a true or a false value. Okay? So, that will certainly work. But let's pretend for a moment that in doesn't work. Let's assume that we want to do the same sort of thing, but without the in operator. How would we do it? Well, we would use a for loop, of course. I would say here, for one letter in s. And then we could say here, if look for equals one letter, we'll say print found look for. All right. And then we can say here something like this. And sure enough, now it's going to find it, found D. So far, so good. What if, though, but we have a few other options here, a few other possibilities. One is, what if, D exists more than once? We're going to ignore that. We're going to assume that we're just interested in finding out, is it in there or not, sort of like the in operator. But what if it's not in there? What if we're looking for exclamation point? Then we're going to get no result whatsoever. So how can I figure out if it's not in there? Well, I could use what we would also often call a flag. I can say here, found it equals false. And then I can say here, found it equals true. And then at the end, where I can just say here something like this, I can now say print, found it. We can even say found look for in s. And so now it's going to say found exclamation point A, B, C, D, F, false. But if we look for D, then sure enough, it's going to be true. Now this will work, but it's kind of annoying that I have to go through the entire string. Doesn't it make sense that once I've already found D, I can just stop? Yeah, I can do that. I can say here, found it equals true, and then I can say break. Right? Why waste time searching? And we're going to get exactly the same result. If we get all the way to the end, then the answer is false. But if we don't get all the way to the end, if we broke somewhere in the middle, then the answer is true. This is where else comes in. What else allows us to do is say something like this. Else print did not find look for. And then I can say here, found look for. What the heck is going on here? So first of all, let's see if it works. So it says yay found D, and if I say here Z, it's going to say, did not find Z. Okay, so the code is clearly working. What in the world is going on? Notice this else is not part of the if. This is a for else, not an if else. And for else means that this section here, the else clause here, runs only if the loop got to its natural end. Meaning, no break. So the idea is, if we encountered a break, then the else is ignored. If we did not encounter a break, if we got to the natural end of the loop, then the else runs. So if you don't have a break in your loop, then else is useless, right? Then it's always going to run because then you might as well just include it there. But if you do have a break in your loop, then else can actually be useful in exactly the sort of case I described now or showed you now, where you would normally need a flag variable to keep track of yes, it happened, no, it didn't happen. And I find else to be really useful in this sort of case. Else works in both for loops and in while loops. And in both places it means exactly the same thing, meaning the loop got to its natural end without a break, and thus we want this clause to run, typically as a sort of default in case something else didn't happen or we didn't find something else. So I really like to use else. There is one problem with it though, at least one problem, which is that people get really confused by it. People are convinced, but absolutely convinced, that this else should not be here aligned with the for, that it should be aligned with the if. But of course that's not true. If we do that, then it's just like not going to work at all, right? We're going to get did not find Z, did not find Z, did not find Z, right? So that might be true. And what if I say here D? Then it's going to say did not find D, did not find D, did not find D, yay, found D. So it's maybe giving us a running total of what's going on, but it's not really what we wanted to happen. So you got to make sure that the else is aligned with a for. People get very confused by this. People don't understand the behavior. And so if part of the point of Python is to make your code readable and maintainable, so that people can spend as little time as possible on maintenance and as much as possible actually doing their work, there are some good arguments in favor of not using else. That said, people who do know what it does, I find, really like it for precisely this reason. It makes your code tighter, clearer, and I'm the first one to admit that they should not have called it else. They should have called it something else. They should have maybe said, reached end of block without encountering a break, which I think we can all agree is a much sort of easier to remember kind of keyword than else. But what can we do? It's in the language, so that's what we got. So you can use else to have a default there at the end of your loops. Use them in for loops, use them in while loops, but make sure there's a break. Otherwise, what's the point?